Good afternoon and welcome. I'm honored to be here and to have been asked to come and moderate this panel with activists and organizers on the ground, as well as the attorneys who represent them on the ground and here in the United States. This was planned well before the recent what would be termed cycle of violence. And what's fortuitous about it is it helps us to add context to this so that we don't immediately jump to think that it's a cycle, because a cycle would indicate that there was calm beforehand, something triggered a new onset of clashes, and what that does is obfuscates the violence of the status quo, which outside of the media cameras and attention on the ground is a reality of daily violence against Palestinians, both who are citizens of the state as well as those who live under occupation, under a matrix of laws that subjects them to arbitrary detention, home demolitions, martial law, a lack of due process, and all those things that would cumulatively add up to an unequivocal lack of equality in the best sense, or in the best case scenario. So what we're seeing right now in the mainstream media is a framing of the conflict that actually exacerbates it, because it draws on Islamophobic tropes in order to frame the violence as one driven by ethnic hatred, and that completely obfuscates a history of settler colonialism, of dispossession, of displacement, and of removal that continues unabated with the unequivocal support of the United States militarily, economically, and diplomatically. And so it's quite necessary and useful for us to have this discussion here, especially with stakeholders whose decisions have an immediate impact on the ground. So indeed, what this panel helps to elucidate is the fundamental nature of Israel's settler colonial ambitions, not just in the occupied territories, but also within Israel itself, again, by dispossession, displacement, and concentration. And it does this through a matrix, a mix of administrative and martial law in East Jerusalem, where the conflict that we're seeing now take place, although it's unfortunate, we don't even know the location of this conflict, and the fact that East Jerusalem is subject to a completely different set of laws than is the rest of the West Bank or Israel or the Gaza Strip. It also uses martial law in the West Bank, counterinsurgency in the Gaza Strip, and as we'll see by this presentation, civil law within Israel itself. Israel considers its Palestinian population, or its own citizens, 20% of its polity, explicitly a demographic threat. It discusses the dangers of their natural population growth as a national security issue, and considers their outright forcible transfer in order to achieve the demographic balance that it desires. Among Israel's most recent legal initiatives aimed at reducing the population of its Palestinian citizens includes the citizenship and entry law into Israel, better known as the ban on family reunification. This law suspends the possibility of Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jerusalem ID holders from gaining permission through family reunification to legally reside within Israel and occupied East Jerusalem with their spouses if they happen to be from the occupied territories. So if somebody, for example, from Haifa or Jaffa or Nazareth or Iqrit happens to study here in the United States and falls in love with a Palestinian who is from the West Bank, say Bethlehem, for example, then they could not live together in Israel anymore because of this ban on family reunification, and it disproportionately impacts the Palestinian citizens of Israel because the target, as articulated by the Israeli Supreme Court in its decision in 2012, was to stop the flow of a flood of refugees. But the threat is not only numeric, it's just as much about competing narratives and about memory, because at stake is a mythology of the state as having been there since time immemorial, and a narrative that there were no people. So as you may recall, Golda Meir, former Prime Minister of Israel, saying, Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. And that what we do by continuing a narrative of a lack of existence of a population is to perpetuate that they are instead marauders, or instead they happen to be sent by neighboring Arab countries hell-bent on destroying the state, again obfuscating the context and the reality on the ground. In fact, in 2011, Israel passed the State Budget Law Amendment, popularly known as the Nakba Law. It penalizes by revoking state funding any institution that either challenges Israel's founding as Jewish and a democratic state, or commemorates Israel's Independence Day as one of mourning or of loss. And so essentially Israel is abridging the freedom of speech for all of its citizens, Jewish nationals and citizens, as well as its Palestinian citizens only, for mentioning the Nakba, or mentioning their historic loss and removal. The Prawer Plan is named after its author, former Deputy National Chair of the National Security Council, Ehud Prawer, and it seeks to remove up to 70,000 Palestinian Bedouins and communities from their homes in the Negev desert to urban townships to make room for Jewish-only settlements within the Israeli state. So this policy of settlement expansion, of removal, dispossession, and concentration is alive and well not only in the settlements in the West Bank, but within Israel itself. And similarly, in 2001, the High Court of Justice rejected an appeal from internally displaced Palestinians to return to their villages of Iqrit and Kfar Biran, which is what we'll hear about at greater length today. They're located near the Lebanon border, and they were forcibly displaced from their homes in 1948. But in 1951, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that they had the right to return to their homes because their presence doesn't disrupt the demographic balance. Nonetheless, they've been their restitution and their return has been impeded, not because of the demographic threat that they pose, but instead because of the threat that they pose to the narrative that they never existed there to begin with. So with that, I'd like to pass on the mic or the floor to experts much more, much better suited and articulate than me to have this discussion. Shadia, and I'll introduce them all and let them speak in the order that I'm introducing them, and then you won't hear from me. Shadia Spade received her master's degree in information management from Haifa University. She serves as the Iqrit Community Association's international coordinator and has taken a leading role in the struggle of displaced villages over the last 20 years. She has also held strategic meetings with key international figures, including Pope Francis, to address the plight of Christian Palestinians. Amir Toumi is a third-generation descendant of Iqrit. Both his grandmother and his grandfather were born there and displaced from their homes in 1948. He studies political science and Asian studies at Haifa University and currently coordinates the Iqrit Youth Action Group. He has been living in a church located in Iqrit as a form of civil disobedience since 2012 and is part of a broader movement of youth activism and movement, which is part of a very rich legacy of nonviolent activism amongst Palestinians that unfortunately we don't hear about. Nadia bin Youssef is a lawyer and human rights advocate, serving as the first U.S. representative for Adala, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel, what we may consider the equivalent of the NAACP here in the United States. She has represented and worked on behalf of the Palestinian Bedouin community in the Negev in southern Israel, or the Naqab, and she is now developing the organization's U.S. advocacy plan to influence American policy and practice towards human rights-based approach in Israel and Palestine. Much of her work in the United States is focused on building a transnational movement against state-sanctioned violence together with artists, community organizers, and cause lawyers. She's a member of the New York State Bar. She resides here in the Northeast, meaning she is available to you to continue thinking about these issues and to developing the policies that will better the lives of these communities and a viable peace with justice in Palestine and Israel. So that's Shadia.
Thank you. I'm here today to tell you about our story, the story of Iqrit. Iqrit is a small village. It lies in the northern border of the Israeli state, close to the Lebanese border. I must say that Israel is a selective democracy. The law of return is being applied only for the Jews. The people of Iqrit were forced to become citizens of the state. This is the same state that forbidden them from having access to their own land of origin. After the foundation of the State of Israel, which is the Nakba, the people of Iqrit numbered 450 people. They were all considered as Israeli citizens with Israeli IDs at the time that they were transferred from their village, and promised that they would be able to return after 2 weeks. The people of the village were even transferred with the army trucks to another village. The 450 people were Christian Palestinians in Iqrit. After 2 weeks, the promise was broken. Like other promises that we kept receiving for the last 67 years from governmental officials. Although we won the court in 1951 and the Israeli High Court of Justice ruled in our favor to return and even ordered the government to allow our return since our transfer was illegal, we are still not able to return to Iqrit. Moreover, the ruling of the High Court was in July 1951. In Christmas Eve 1951, the same year, the Israeli army, ordered by Prime Minister back then, Ben-Gurion, demolished the whole village, except the church and the cemetery. The church that we use till today. From 1948 till the early 70s, Iqrit we had military ruling in the northern area, and Iqrit was declared a closed military area. People couldn't move from one village to another without any permission from the army, including Iqrit. The people of Iqrit found it very difficult to keep the struggle during these years. After the 70s, the struggle continued in a different direction since people had access to their own land. They could renovate their own church, and we returned to hold our masses in the Iqrit church, also to bury the dead in the Iqrit cemetery. Meanwhile, the people of Iqrit are able to achieve their return to their village only by death. When you die, you are allowed to return to your village and to your land. When you are born, you are, it's okay with the state to Christian the babies in the Iqrit church and also to get married in the Iqrit church. All the important events of our life, we have it in Iqrit, but we are not allowed to live between these events, between the birth and the death. We are all dispersed all over the northern area of the State of Israel, and this makes it more difficult to be organized in the struggle. However, we have been determined ever since our exile to return, and currently are increasing our efforts with the activism of the youth. Today we are 1,400 people united and determined to achieve return. We are talking about a case in which the citizens of the state were exiled. There was a broken promise by the army and by the state officials. We are talking about the contempt of court since 1951. We are talking about not implementing the recommendations of an official ministerial committee by the state itself. We are talking about neglecting the basic right to observe our culture, our religion and heritage. We are allowed only to pray and to bury our dead people and not to live in the village. We face pending demolition for the access road to our church, for the roof of our cemetery, All this because we live under the state that doesn't treat its citizens equally, discriminating between its citizens, giving priority to the Jewish community, and oppressing the Palestinian minority, which is us. I would like to present Amir Tommy, one of the youth activists who are living in the Church of Iqrit for the last 3 years and being harassed by the government, the Israeli land administration, and the police. He would like to tell you about his experience.
Everyone, it is our honor to be here today, and it's my honor personally to tell you my story of return. My name is Amir Tommy. I'm a student at the University of Haifa. I am one of the 12 young adults who made the commitment to live in our church on our land and carry out the decision which granted us the right of return. However, our lives are made difficult by the officials who arrive frequently to Iqrit and harass us by taking us into custody, confiscating our personal belongings, uprooting our trees, the trees that we plant, and removing our firewood that we preserve for the winter, the hard winters in Iqrit. Despite these disturbances, our group remains fully committed and defiant. We realize that we can no longer wait for the state of Israel to keep its word. Instead, we decided to live justice. We decided to return to Iqrit and live in that church on that hill that we call our land. We have established foundations for return, created a model which is replicable. We actively preserve our heritage, cultural life, and community life by holding regular activities in Iqrit, such as seasonal conferences, workshops, and festivals, which creates life in Iqrit de facto. We are living in that church, and the thing that we are best at is living, because as you have been told, we can die in Iqrit, but we cannot live there. We can do everything on the land of our village, but we cannot live there. Shall
I just want to refer to what was said about the demographic change. It is the big fear of the state that the majority is thought to be the Jewish community. But despite the fact that our case is not making any demographic change in the state of Israel, we are already Israeli citizens by force. We hold Israeli IDs and we vote. But still, we are not allowed to practice our life as a community. So even though there is always a reason why not to make justice with Palestinians. So it doesn't make any demographic change, but yet you are not allowed to return. It is always said that the Palestinians are practicing a violent struggle. This is what the world hears all the time. We are practicing this peaceful struggle by going to the court, by going to the government officials, by negotiating with the state, by discussing our struggle with the ministerial committee, by demonstrating. And yet, it is the most peaceful struggle was done in Palestine since 1948, but yet we are not able to return. Another thing, the Christians in the Middle East, there is always this sentence that the Israelis like to say about the safest place in the Middle East for the Christians is Israel. We are Christians, we are Palestinian Christians, but yet we are not being treated in a special way. We don't feel that we are having any exceptional conditions in any matter of displacement. And we also don't want this, don't misunderstand me. But it is a part of the Israeli policy to divide us, to divide the Palestinian people into Christians and Muslims and Druze. But yet, we are all having the same suffer. We are here today, and it is very important to speak in front of you. Because we all know that the state, your state, is the first and maybe the only supporter of the Israeli state. Supported with a lot of money, which goes to a lot of purposes towards the war. And we are here today to urge you to take action, to speak about Iqrit as one of the internal displaced cases. The Palestinian struggle is that part of the Palestinian people are under occupation in the areas that we call 67 areas. The other part is the refugees. The third part is us, the internally displaced Palestinians living inside the state. Our problems are much bigger than discrimination and lack of equality. These are not our only problems. The majority of the Palestinians inside the state of Israel are internally displaced. It means that they were transferred, evacuated from their own villages. I don't know if evacuated is the right name. I'm looking for the right. Exiled also from their own villages and forced to move to other Palestinian villages in which we live till this day, for 20 minutes ride from our home, while Israeli settlements are built in these lands, and we are forbidden from access to our original lands. In Iqrit, no Israeli settlement was built, and it is not by chance. It's because of the ruling of the High Court, because the state of Israel is not interested in evoking this issue. So they keep the land empty. But yet we are not allowed to return. This is our story. If you have, after that Nadia finished her part, to ask any questions, we are here to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadia and Amir. Thank you, Noura, for setting the context. And it's an extraordinary story. It's an extraordinary story. If you really think about what Shadia and Amir just told you, and the way that it's a microcosm, too, of understanding largely what's happening in Israel, in some ways, the story of Iqrit is the best story. It's the best case scenario for Palestinians who remained inside Israel, who became citizens, who have, in the hierarchy of rights, this is the best case scenario. And so the fact that what they just described, being displaced from their ancestral land, being unable to return despite nonviolent resistance, despite going to the courts, despite doing everything right, for example, this is what we're talking about. This is the best case scenario. And why is that? The best case scenario, this is possible because of the inherent nature of the state, which Noura referred to. The three things, maybe the four, that I want to talk about briefly, and I think most of it is your reflections and your response to this story that I'm interested in and having a discussion with you. But first is the displacement is legal. All of what you've heard, and the displacement of all Palestinians has been made legal, either legal as it was happening or retroactively legalized by various laws. So the displacement is legal. We're talking about legal displacement, legal violations of rights. We need to think about what that means. The second is that displacement is ongoing, and Noura referred to this as well. The story of Iqrit, you can talk about displacement for Palestinians in two ways. Certainly the displacement of people in 48 as a result of the Nakba. So that's one group that are being displaced. So the Iqrit and the Iqrit community, the 530 villages that were demolished at the time and displaced. So you have that displacement, and you have the displacement that is happening now. Most of that, right in our present moment, is happening in terms of within the state of Israel, in the Nakab, in the Negev, in the south of Israel, with the Palestinian Bedouin community. So displacement is legal, displacement is ongoing. The third, I referenced it before, is that displacement is inevitable. In the current construction and not the current construction, the entire construction of the state of Israel, this colonial legal regime that Noura referenced, which is predicated on equality, on control of land, on maintaining power, makes displacement of Palestinians inevitable, makes the suspension of their rights inevitable. Displacement is legal, displacement is ongoing, displacement is inevitable. And the fourth thing is we opened with the reality of what's happening in Israel today, what's happening in Israel, what's happening to Palestinians. And we said, what does this have to do with it? And what I said very clearly, I mean, displacement is a symptom. The violence that we're seeing is a symptom of the daily oppression, of the daily violation of human rights that's happening to Palestinians. So I'll just go a bit quickly, and maybe it just gives you a bit of a framework to understand how this happened, how it continues to happen, and what it would mean for us to rethink, reimagine this not happening, reimagine return. I think what's so extraordinary, and I hope is what you take from this beyond everything, is the hope embodied by Amir and the struggle of the youth activists. The idea that they said, your courts, your laws, this state is not designed to protect my rights as a Palestinian, as a non-Jewish citizen of a Jewish state. As a non-Jewish citizen of a Jewish state. How do I protect my rights? The courts can't do it. The law cannot do it. It cannot. Inherently, it says there are certain privileges and certain rights for certain people on the basis of their ethnic or national belonging. Those rights are uplifted. So the young people say, the law is not the answer. The courts are not the answer. I'm speaking as a representative of Adala, which is a legal center. Adala uses the courts. We use the Israeli legal system to try to protect and promote the rights of Palestinians, but essentially what we're doing is we're using the law to expose how the law itself is not the answer. We're lawyers who know that the law is not the answer. That's basically how I frame what Adala is doing. But young people also know that. Young people also know that, and they've seen it and experienced it. So the fact that they're saying the law is not the answer, the courts are not going to protect our rights, the international community has failed us, what we're going to do is take our return. And we're doing it, which I think is what's so extraordinary, not just as descendants of Iqrit. We're doing it as Palestinians. We're doing it on behalf of a right of return that exists for all Palestinians, all Palestinian refugees, all Palestinian displaced people. It's an extraordinary, hopeful story, so I hope that you leave here with that sense. It's an amazing thing that's happening, and maybe you can speak even more about how that developed and the ripple effect. So just quickly, and I would reference, if you're interested or if your people are interested, Adala has a discriminatory laws database which tracks all of the legislation that really lays out exactly how this happened and how it continues to happen. But just briefly, Shadia mentioned Iqrit at the time of the Nakba. Everyone is familiar with this term? The Nakba? Yeah? It means catastrophe. It means catastrophe in Arabic. And it's the way in the Palestinian historical narrative to describe the events of 1948, the events of the establishment of the State of Israel, whereby 85% of Palestinians became refugees, their land was confiscated, their villages were demolished, the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. So this is the establishment of the State of Israel, which resulted in the displacement of the people of Iqrit and displacement of the majority of Palestinians from their land. So the Nakba, okay? I think that's important to make sure that it's part of our, and as Noura said, the Nakba for Palestinians, as a result of the law, it's impossible to commemorate the Nakba in Israel. Just think about that for a second. it's impossible to commemorate the Nakba in Israel. So what makes Iqrit so revolutionary and so threatening to the status quo is the narrative, the disruption of the narrative. Because if you say that this is a result of the Nakba, and people say, we can say Nakba. Don't say Nakba. What's the Nakba? I've never heard of the Nakba. Iqrit and the youth movement have made the Nakba relevant in public discourse. I really think that because of you all, there's a law of, not being able to commemorate the Nakba. Extraordinary work. So, what happened? You have the 530 villages destroyed, demolished during the Nakba. Iqrit is one of them. Depopulated, we say. So these are depopulated villages. People were forced to leave their homes, left their land, went to either neighboring villages, internally displaced people, or became refugees in the area around. So the way that this worked was a military regulation. So you could close areas like Iqrit. It became a closed military zone, so you couldn't re-enter that area. As they said, Palestinians who remained inside the state of Israel. So this is, at the time, 150,000 people, which now are 1.4 million people, 20% of the population. But at the time, 150,000. That group was under a military regime until 1966. They became citizens in 1952. So these are citizens of Israel. Citizens of Israel under a military regime until 1966. Military law, martial law, was in place in order to manage that situation. So you had, in order to prevent residents from returning to their land, you had closed military zones. This is what happened in Iqrit. The two most important laws, foundational laws that allowed this to happen, are the absentee property law, the absentees property law. So it defined people who fled, people who left their villages as absentees. They left their property, and the state took control of that property. Absentee property law of 1950, right? So then, in 1953, that confiscation of property, and we're talking all sorts of property, but in this case, say land and buildings and things like this. In 1953, all of that was legalized. What happened is that as a result of these two laws, the state of Israel gained control of 93% of the land of Israel. It holds it in its hands. The state controls 93% of the land. The state controls 93% of the land. Holds it. And essentially, this is the massive confiscation. It's taking all the land, it's taking all the villages, and legalizing it. So the state says, absolutely, we had a right to confiscate that land. And Adala and others have tried to challenge those confiscations that happened in the 1950s. You have obviously the story and the legal struggle of Iqrit that's going forward to try to get and to reclaim, restore, return to the land. But as you'll see, and as we know, and as I explained, the court and the law is not designed to give you back that land. These laws were meant purely to confiscate. Purely to confiscate. When you see the enormous amount of land that was confiscated, the enormous, 93% of the land of Israel, confiscated with these two laws. The purpose is arbitrary in that it's not necessarily for a public good or a public purpose, though the court will say that it is. We can talk about whether that's the case in Iqrit. The court will say, the state will say, no, there was a public purpose for it, and that public purpose was a number of things. But essentially, that confiscation was simply for the purpose of grabbing the land. One of the cases that I want to lift up, and there's two cases maybe, is the case of Lajun, which is another of the depopulated villages that Adala tried with the community to try to return that land to the people. The case of Lajun, and I want to just briefly touch on a case that's happening now in the Nakba. So the case of Lajun. This land was confiscated in November of 1953. This is an area in the Triangle region in center of Israel. It was confiscated in 1953 for what purpose? Why was it confiscated? Why was the land confiscated? The state said it's essential for settlement and development needs. Essential. So that was the framing. Turns out what happened, there was a small little man-made forest, which is the case for many of these villages, that forests were planted on top of ruins of villages, and a small industrial facility there. But in terms of essential settlement and development, we were challenging that, whether it was used for its purpose. So you'll see the way that we use the law is in this technical way in order to disrupt the system, but essentially we have a small technical argument. We filed in 2007 saying it was never used for that purpose. The court rejected it in 2010, saying no, in fact, the confiscation was valid because of the 1953 law that I referenced, the land acquisition. You were able to confiscate that land legally, and we agreed. And they said, in fact, planting a man-made forest is and can be considered a kind of settlement. Right? Maybe. Why not? They prioritize the idea that you can plant trees for a political purpose. We call this the politics of plantation. So you were able to plant trees, take over the land, and the court said that's valid. That's a proper use of that land. That's what we meant when we said essential settlement or development needs, because everyone wants green space, and yes, we can. In 2010. So we, as we do, lost that case. The court rejected our petition. And the best that we came up with at the very end was kind of a principle statement where we asked the state to sign that before the establishment of the state, these people lived here and this was their land. The state signed it because there was no concept that the land would be restored to these people. It's not designed to restore the rights of these people. And the case of Iqrit explains that really well, I think. Why? So Shadi was saying, we're not a demographic threat, which is a huge problem for Israel. The idea that there might be more Palestinians in the state than Jewish citizens. And that's a threat. The threat to the demographic balance threatens the idea that it can be a democracy. So we're talking about demography, the numbers of people, and you have to have the majority of people be Jewish in order to maintain the democratic character of the state. Just think about that for a second. What we mean by that. That's not the case in Iqrit. That's not the case in Iqrit. They're citizens of Israel. They already are a demographic threat. From 450 to 1400. They're a demographic threat anyway. But they pose no additional threat than what they are. So it's not about that. What is it about? The idea and the precedent that's being set, why we're losing Lajun, why you lose Iqrit, why you will lose every case where you try to restore your rights in court, is because of the precedent, that it sets. If they allow Iqrit, and they did, in 51 they said, yeah, go back, we have no right to keep you from your land. But if they allowed them to implement that, you have millions of refugees. You have tens of thousands of internally displaced people that would have a right to return to their land. And the state is saying we cannot maintain our identity as a Jewish state. We cannot continue to privilege the rights of Jewish people over the rights of non-Jewish people if we allow this to happen. So the implementation of these decisions is really problematic for the state. Despite the fact, of course, that the right of return exists, that the right of return is valid, that there is such thing as a right of return protected in international law, protected by human rights law. What does that mean? I went in many ways as a young lawyer to Israel-Palestine because it's the battleground for human rights in many ways. If it matters there, if we can make it matter there, and my call to you is that we make it matter. I don't know where you all come from. You're working in civil society, you are working here in corridors of power, you are journalists, you are artists, I don't know who you are. My call to you, whatever you're doing, is to make it matter. Make it matter. Make human rights matter. That's what we're trying to do. Make it matter. If it matters here, it matters. If the right of refugees can be protected here, it can be protected. If it doesn't matter here, if it cannot be protected here, it will be protected nowhere. And I can give you other examples, but as Noura also mentioned, this mass confiscation, the mass displacement that's happening now and continues to happen within the borders of 48, the borders of Israel, which is in the Nakab, where up to 70,000 Palestinian Bedouin are at threat of displacement. Now, it's something that I want you to maybe to learn more about. We have a lot of resources on Adala's website, and a lot of our partners working in this have taken it very seriously. It's a huge threat, but it's also something that we cannot challenge by law. Adala just in May lost a case for the Israeli Supreme Court, which was our Iqrit of the Nakab, our strongest case. It was our strongest case. It was a village, it's called al-Hiran. It was established by the state in 1956 by military order in this time of the military regime. So it was established by the state. All of that is supported by documents and archives, and the people were given land in this area, and the state has decided to instead demolish that village. We're talking 1,000 people, demolish the village and establish a new Jewish town called Hiran, and I'll just say those names again. The Bedouin town is called, the Palestinian Bedouin town is called Hiran. The new Jewish town is called Hiran. They're demolishing Hiran, establishing Hiran in its place. And we went to the court and we said, you can't do that, can you? Can you do that? Can you demolish one village and displace certain people because of who they are, because of their ethnic and national belonging, and replace them with another group of people? And the court said yes. The court said yes. We lost this case May 4th of 2015. You can just check.
Part of the story of why the court says yes, and the story that's being told, was the holding that those Bedouins didn't belong, but instead that they had come from neighboring Arab countries. And so even their indigeneity is challenged, notwithstanding the fact that in archival records that were presented before the court, it was shown that the military actually discussed the population there, and they had title. And so notwithstanding the title and the recognition by the military, that those things were superseded. I just think that that's also important, why this isn't also a lack of effective counsel or a great case, but this is, you know, what the military will try. Just to add, no.
That's it. I mean, that's the, exactly. Exactly, remember that. It doesn't matter. Citizenship doesn't matter. These are citizens of Israel. Citizenship doesn't matter. A great case doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is whether you are Palestinian or whether you are Jewish. Whether you get full rights as citizens, whether you're guaranteed your rights as human beings or you're not. That's all that matters. And the court will justify it, and the state will justify it in various ways. And so on some level, I'm so grateful to hear this story and to elevate, and so that you have in your minds and on your lips the name Iqrit. I want you to follow this story, and I want you to be inspired by this story, but I also want to make sure that Iqrit is perceived as an example. It's an example. It's an example of a larger policy that will always result in the suspension of the rights of Palestinians in order to privilege the rights of the Jewish community. It has to. This is the nature of the state. And I think the reason, you know, I want to simplify it and make it pretty essential for you, that that's the reality that we're dealing with. And when we do that, when we're able to understand exactly what's at stake, I think a lot of pretty exciting things can happen. And I want us to, if we can, get into something that's pretty extraordinary in terms of what has been happening in building the movement for justice in Palestine and justice for Palestinians, which Noura, I hope you can speak to maybe a bit. But the idea that when you start talking about the essential nature of what's happening, that we're lifting up these stories, but these stories are just examples of the larger structure. When you get to the essence of it, it's about issues of supremacy. It's about issues of supremacy. And whether we as an international community, whether we as the United States, whether we as citizens of this place who believe in human rights and believe in justice accept that. And so what has been happening recently is to tie, because we're using universal language and values and we're de-exceptionalizing Israel-Palestine and we're bringing it into this language of human rights, language of equality, of supremacy, we're seeing extraordinary links happening between other oppressed communities around the world. One in particular that I hope you follow and that you bring back to your congressman and your civil society organizations and your media outlets is the idea of Black Palestinian solidarity, Black Americans engaging in this struggle because the struggles are linked, because the struggles are fundamentally linked, and the struggles are about challenging systems of supremacy, challenging meaningless or conditional citizenship on the basis of who you are. And that's been one of the most exciting things. So I think there's two really hopeful things for you to leave this place with in the midst of a devastating time for Palestinians, in the midst of a devastating, heartbreaking month. There are two really hopeful things that I want you to take from it. One is the story of Iqrit, the idea that people are demanding their rights and living into justice. I think you said this, Amina, and it was so beautiful. Living into justice. And the other is that this is starting to make sense in a really powerful way, what's happening in Israel. It's not something that nobody can understand. It's not something that you need a PhD, that you need to study, to struggle with, because you know it, and you have ideas about it. So on that note, thank you for being here, and any questions are great.
Great, thank you.